Watch the video.
The Picts, a mysterious people who carved their secrets into stone, whose warriors fought with painted faces, and whose kings ruled from fortified strongholds in the misty north of Scotland. They were fierce, proud, and deeply enigmatic, yet within a span of a single generation, they vanished, their language silenced, their culture erased, their identity dissolved into the mists of time. But what happened? Was it conquest, assimilation, or annihilation? Stay with me until the very end, because what you're about to discover is not just a story of Vikings clashing with the Picts. It is the scandalous unraveling of an entire nation, a betrayal of identity, a murder of memory, and perhaps the greatest cultural disappearance in European history. Before the Viking sails cut through the North Sea, the Picts were thriving. They weren't some barbarian tribe lost to history. They were a confederation of kings with carved stones that still stand today, their symbols hauntingly indecipherable. Their strongholds, like the mighty Burghead Fort, loomed over the coastline, testifying to power and ambition. Imagine standing inside those stone walls as smoke from hearth fires rose, banners fluttered, and carved bulls, the Pictish emblem, guarded the gates. These were not people destined to fade quietly into history. But here's the riddle. How does a society so vibrant, so rooted in its land, disappear almost overnight? To understand that, we must meet the destroyers, the Vikings. And once you hear what they did, you'll understand why the Picts were never the same again. The 8th and 9th centuries, a time when horizons themselves seemed to bleed with menace. Picture the still waters of the North Sea at dawn, the mist parting to reveal shapes that should never have been there. Longships, sleek and fast, their dragon-headed prows snarling at the world. Their sails ballooned in the wind like blood-stained banners. On board, men clad in iron and leather gripped their axes and swords, their voices rising in chants that promised death. The Vikings did not come to trade. They came to plunder. Their first targets were monasteries, remote, wealthy, and undefended. Monks clutching manuscripts and relics were cut down where they stood, their sanctuaries reduced to smoldering ruins, gold, chalices, sacred texts ripped away, carried into the dark unknown. But this was only the beginning. With every raid, their hunger grew. They set their gaze upon the Pictish coastline, fertile and exposed. The nightmare spread. Imagine villages swallowed in flame, the air thick with smoke and screams. Picture farmers cut down in their fields, their blood staining the soil that once fed them. Women and children torn from their homes, dragged in chains onto longships, bound for lives of slavery across the sea. These were not isolated raids. This was a calculated storm of terror, striking again and again, leaving scars across Scotland's northern lands so deep that centuries later, the earth still seemed to remember them. Yet the Picts were not fragile prey. They hardened their defenses, reforged their alliances, and learned to strike back. Their warriors stood on cliffs with shields raised, watching the seas for the next wave of invaders. But no matter how brave, how defiant, a people can only resist for so long against and thrives on blood and fire. And so one battle, one catastrophic clash would decide their fate. When the smoke cleared, the Picts would stand broken on the edge of oblivion. Archaeology tells us more than any written record. At Burghead, the largest Pictish stronghold ever found, researchers uncovered something chilling. The fort had been consumed by fire, a deliberate act. Think about that. A fortress meant to symbolize permanence, turned into ash. Some of its mighty carved stones were saved from the flames, buried, hidden from the invaders. It is as though the Picts themselves tried to preserve fragments of their identity, even as destruction engulfed them. The Aberdeen research team described it as both tragic and extraordinary. The flames that destroyed Burghead may have preserved the remains we now unearth. A cultural murder, and yet a time capsule. But if Burghead fell, what hope was left? That question is answered on a battlefield where thousands would die. The chronicles that survive do not describe Viking attacks as random acts of chance. They speak of something colder, sharper, and infinitely more dangerous: systematic violence. The Vikings struck not only where wealth was stored, but where identity itself was rooted. Communities were torched until nothing remained but ash. Monasteries, the libraries of the Picts, were stripped bare and their guardians slaughtered. Where sacred chants once echoed, only the silence of ruin remained. The National paints these raids not merely as military actions, but as cultural assassinations. It was as though the Vikings understood that to kill a people, you must also kill their memory. Each fire was more than destruction. It was a message, a declaration that the Picts' world could be erased. And yet, the Picts refused to bow. They fought with desperate ferocity, wielding stone and steel against the iron tide. Imagine their warriors gathered in smoke-filled halls, swearing oaths to defend their lands at all costs. They pushed back, ambushing raiding parties, striking at night, bleeding their invaders in bitter defiance. But resistance demands blood. Every counterstrike drained their strength. Every victory came at a devastating cost. And in the end, there was one reckoning they could not escape. A clash so brutal, so absolute, that it shattered their dynasty forever. That reckoning came in the year 839. This is the moment where Pictish history fractures beyond repair. The year is 839. The Picts, worn by decades of raids but not broken, gathered their might. Side by side with their Scottish allies of Dal Riata, their kings marched north to meet the Vikings in open battle. It was a gamble born of desperation, a final stand to protect their land, their faith, their very existence. But the gamble failed. What followed was not simply defeat, but annihilation. The annals record the carnage with chilling brevity. The king of Fortriu, the very heart of Pictish power, lay dead. With him fell the king of Dal Riata, and with them a generation of nobles and heirs. It was as though the axe had cleaved through the spine of the kingdom, severing leadership, lineage, and hope in one swing. Picture the battlefield after the slaughter. Bodies strewn across the heather, shields splintered, swords rusting in blood-soaked earth. The cries of the wounded fading into silence as carrion birds circled overhead. What had begun as a stand for survival ended as a graveyard for dynasties. This was more than a military defeat. It was decapitation. A kingdom stripped of its rulers, its succession in chaos, its people left adrift. And into this void, a new figure would rise, one who would not save the Picts, but seal their fate. Out of the chaos rose a man, Kenneth McAlpin. To some, he was a hero who united the Scots and Picts into one kingdom. But to others, his story reeks of betrayal. Later chroniclers whisper of a bloody banquet where Pictish nobles were treacherously slain by Kenneth's men. Whether fact or legend, it captures the scandal of the moment. A people brought low not only by Viking swords, but by political intrigue. Under Kenneth, Gaelic language and culture took precedence. The Pictish tongue disappeared. Their symbols ceased. Their kingship ended. Some say it was assimilation. Others call it genocide. Which was it? And why does history remember so little? If you've been drawn into this unraveling of a people's fate, this is only the beginning. On this channel, we uncover history's darkest betrayals and mysteries, the stories that textbooks soften, but which shaped entire civilizations. If you want more of this kind of truth, hit that like button, subscribe, and ring the bell so you never miss the scandals history tried to bury. Now, let's follow the trail of disappearance to its bitter end. Languages do not vanish overnight, unless the people who speak them are silenced. The Pictish language, spoken across the north for centuries, died out within a generation of Kenneth's rule. Not a single sentence of it survives, only names on stones, indecipherable symbols carved into rock. Think about that. An entire worldview, a way of seeing reality, deleted. Some scholars argue it was absorbed into Gaelic. Others think it was deliberately suppressed. Either way, when a language dies, so too does memory, and with memory, identity. But still, traces remained, hidden in the stones and in the echoes of place names across Scotland. Despite the violence, despite the betrayal, the Picts refused to vanish entirely. Their carved stones still rise from the earth, towering crosses, spirals, symbols that remain unsolved. Some see warriors, others see strange animals, celestial maps, or even coded language. But the truth? No one knows. It is the ultimate cliffhanger of the Pictish people, a message carved into eternity, waiting to be read. These stones are their rebellion against oblivion, Their way of saying, we were here, we mattered, and we will not be forgotten. But the question is, why were they silenced so completely? Historians wrestle with the Pictish disappearance. Was it Viking violence that destroyed them? Or Kenneth's calculated assimilation? Or perhaps both, working together in a grim duet of blood and politics? Some suggest the destruction is overstated, that Pictish DNA flows in the veins of modern Scots, that their culture simply blended into the Gaelic mainstream. Others argue it was a cultural killing, a deliberate erasure. What makes it chilling is not knowing. The silence in the sources is louder than words. And in that silence, we are left to wonder, was this the fate of the Picts, or the fate of all cultures that stand in the way of conquest? The story of the Picts is not just about Vikings and kings. It is about what happens when a culture is caught between violence and betrayal. It is about the fragility of identity and how quickly it can be stolen. They were not merely conquered, they were erased. Their voice silenced, their memory overwritten, their stones left as mute witnesses. But here's the scandalous truth. Perhaps the greatest destruction of the Picts is not that the Vikings killed them or that Kenneth betrayed them. It is that we today barely remember them. Their story was left to rot in the margins of history until only whispers remained. If you've made it this far, you're one of the few who refuses to let history's mysteries stay buried. So subscribe, like, and ring the bell for more stories of betrayal, blood, and silence. The Picts may have vanished, but here, their voices are remembered. And maybe, just maybe, that's the one victory history could never take from them.